My daughter stopped calling my husband Papa after she heard him say that she is not his real daughter. Now he's devastated and crying because she refuses to let him walk her down the aisle. I got pregnant with my daughter Sarah when I was in college. My parents and my then boyfriend's parents pushed us to marry, and we did. My late husband unfortunately passed away a week after our daughter's second birthday because of a heart complication that we did not even know he had. It was a very hard time for me and I went through a very bad depression. 4 years later, I met my now husband, Robert, on a blind date set up by a friend. He was one of my best friend's cousins. We hit it off and got married a year later. Even when we were dating, he was very hands-on with my daughter, and it did not take too long for my daughter to call him Papa. Even until we got married and when I got pregnant 2 years into the marriage and gave birth to twins, he still acted like a father to Sarah. She was included in my husband's family reunions and the cousin group photo shoot that my in-laws organize every Christmas. Things took a bit of a turn when Sarah turned 18. She started calling him by his first name, and Robert and I were taken aback by her attitude change. I asked Robert what that was about, but he only shrugged, not knowing the reason. I thought things would return to normal, but she has consistently called him by his first name, so I asked her if we could talk. Robert asked if he could join, to which Sarah agreed. To summarize, my daughter overheard my husband talking about a Father's Day trip to his friend who owns a hostel. His friend asked him if he had forgotten to include Sarah since my husband had only asked him to prepare 3 bedrooms. My husband replied that he planned this trip for his real children only. It wouldn't make sense if Sarah were on the trip since he wasn't her real father. This made Sarah feel betrayed and hurt because she saw him as her real dad even if she knew he was her stepdad. My husband tried to explain that though he loved her as a father, his love for the twins was different since they were his real children. I wanted to just shut him up because he was overusing the word real, but Sarah told us to leave her room. What made that day even more depressing was that this day was her last week with us before she left the country for college. Since then, every time she comes home, Sarah acts like nothing happened but continues to call Robert by his first name. Robert didn't want to add fuel to the fire and tolerated it. And now, a few years after that, my daughter has announced her engagement to her longtime boyfriend. We were very happy for her as they have been dating since they were still college freshmen. 2 weeks before their wedding, we wondered who would be walking Sarah down the aisle. I assumed it would be Robert since I thought we had moved past that incident, but no. My daughter scoffed at me when I told her about Robert walking her down the aisle. She said, "I thought it was obvious that Uncle Greg, my late husband's brother, would be the one to do that. Besides, I'm not his real daughter. It wouldn't make sense if he walked me down the aisle." I did not talk back, instead apologized for my ignorance and told her that I'll speak with Robert about it since he also assumed he'd be the one to walk her down the aisle. When I told him what Sarah said, he was pissed, but I politely reminded him of the incident years ago, which upset him even more. He noted that it was a long time ago and that Sarah should move on. I, who was offended for my daughter, told him that he shouldn't be upset since he doesn't see her as his real child anyway. He then got teary-eyed and told me to not speak to him. He still attended Sarah's wedding but looked visibly down. We still aren't on good terms and have been pretending in front of relatives. My daughter does not know about this and I want to keep it that way. But nevertheless, it's been a week since my daughter's wedding and Robert is still upset. He only talks to me about the twins and household stuff, but beyond that, he keeps everything to himself. I feel really bad and think he is acting this way because of me. My husband had been telling everyone that he was the one who had been teaching me to drive, so I snapped and told everyone that he would yell at me until he was blue in the face. For my whole life, I have had a lot of anxiety when it comes to driving. It has never been too much of a problem, as I live in a city and I can walk wherever I need to go. I have been married to my husband, Stan, for 3 years, together for 6. Throughout our relationship, he has tried to help me learn how to drive. The problem is Stan is not a very good teacher and gets very impatient and angry every time we try. Honestly, he's very patient about most things. He has always been weird about the driving thing, because I'm a grown woman and should know how to drive. We go to the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse sometimes. It's huge. Anyway, if I make one small mistake, for example, if I don't check my mirrors for a long enough time, Stan yells at me. I would already be nervous at the wheel, but all the yelling would cause me to break down and cry. I have a brother, Paul, with whom I hang out typically once a week. A few months ago, I talked to Paul about how I wanted to learn to drive, but I was very nervous about it. He offered to help teach me when we hung out. Paul's husband, Chris, also was willing to help me out, and they made me feel so much more at ease behind the wheel. I thought I was bad at driving, but I was just anxious. Another factor that made me want to learn, besides feeling like I need to do this, is that Stan has told me that he won't have a child with me until I get my license, which I understand. 2 weeks ago, on my day off from work, Paul and Chris took me to the DMV, and I finally got my license. I also bought a used car a few days ago from the money I've been saving for years. I'm so happy and have the support of my brother and his husband. I thought Stan would be mad that I did all of this behind his back, and he was somewhat disappointed that I didn't want his help. I love him so much, but he wasn't the right teacher for me. Anyway, on Sunday, Stan and I both had off from work, and he told me he had a surprise for me. He took me to his parents' house, where they celebrated me, basically like a little party congratulating me because I learned how to drive. Halfway through, my mother-in-law gave a speech about how proud she was of me and also proud of my husband for all the support and lessons he gave me. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. Stan had been telling everyone that he was the one who had been teaching me to drive. I snapped and told everyone, basically, that the few times Stan tried to teach me, I always ended up crying because he would yell at me until he was blue in the face. Paul and Chris were the only people who helped me and gave me confidence. And that, if anything, Stan made things worse for me, which was true. But now, Stan won't talk to me. His father told him that it was a shame for him to do that and that it is not something a good husband would do. His mother said the same and apologized to me. I felt that my husband was very ashamed of the situation, so he asked me to go home right afterward. I feel like an but at the same time, everything I said was true.
My neighbors kept trespassing on my property to use my man-made pond, but they refused to pay for it, so I got it filled up. For the past several years, I've owned a property in a semi-rural area. It is part of an HOA with only 12 houses over 1,000 acres, so we don't get much in each other's way. There is a common area that abuts my property, and on it, there is a pond fed via an irrigation headgate on a creek on my property and a cut that runs from it through my property. I've come to discover this pond is a real pain. One neighbor used to maintain it, without making a fuss, but he died. So dealing with it fell to me as the neighbor most affected by it. And it's a pain. People trespass to go fishing or have their dogs swim in it. People from outside have come to ice skate on it. Totally unsafe. It has silting problems. The headgate needs to be dug out every spring, sometimes multiple times. The cut clogs up and has to be cleared. Then a beaver took up residence and kept blocking the outflow culvert, causing a flood on the neighboring farmer's land. He was rightly pissed, and I got the brunt of it. I was clearing out beaver blockages several days a week. Nobody else in the HOA would help. I did some research and discovered that the water right for the headgate belonged to me alone and not the association. There was no easement for the irrigation cut, and, cherry on the sundae, the pond is actually on my property and not a common area. I had a survey done just to be sure. I also discovered it wasn't a pond. It was a hole dug up to provide fill for our road, and the original developer just routed irrigation into the hole and called it a pond. But this explains why it is such a mess. A landowner a mile away is now digging out a proper pond and has to pay a ton to dispose of the fill, even though it is clean. I asked if it would help if he could put some of the fill in our pond, and he offered to pay for the privilege. I have closed the headgate and started draining the pond. Some members of the HOA have been yelling at me that they like the pond, just to look at as they drive out to the main road. So I said, okay, if you like it, pay up to $10,000 a year for someone to deal with the nonsense. They refused. I said that in that case, the pond was getting filled in and planted with native grass, using the money from taking the fill. They call me a selfish a-hole. Update, I already met with a beaver expert from Fish and Wildlife. They would have given me a nuisance permit to trap, but I wanted to try an exclusion fence. Nobody else wanted to pay for that. The expert said that if we lower the pond, the beaver will probably just move back to the creek. We have fish in the pond, but it isn't deep enough to support overwintering, so the actual sustained fish population is in the creek. Finally, I spoke to the local conservation district about a permit to drain. They said it should not be an issue, as they don't love these fake ponds and would prefer the water stay in the creek to support higher stream flow.